In this story, you'll learn about the seven wonders of the ancient world, not as distant legends, but as real creations of people who lived thousands of years ago. You'll be transported to the scorching sands of Egypt and witness the pyramids of Giza rising, the only wonder that has survived to this day. You'll visit mysterious Babylon, where people still debate whether the Hanging Gardens actually existed. You will hear the story of the majestic temple of Artemis, learn about the fate of the giant statue of Zeus, and imagine the light of the lighthouse of Alexandria, which guided ships for centuries. This is a peaceful journey through time, about faith, ambition, and humanity's desire to leave a mark on eternity. A story that you can not only learn about, but also feel. The old chronicles do not describe a castle as a warm home. They describe it as a fortress, and if its walls defended against enemies by day, in winter they became something else entirely, keepers of the cold. Imagine a morning in such a place. It is still dark. Light barely filters through a narrow window covered with cloth or thin sheets of mica. Glass exists, but it is a luxury, and even where it has been fitted into the frame, it holds almost no warmth. The cold passes through it as easily as through air. You lie perfectly still. The first thing you feel is not sound, not light. It is cold, not sharp, not biting. It is slow and deep, as though the air itself has cooled during the night and now rests gently against your face, patient and unhurried. You do not move, because moving means leaving the warmth that has gathered beneath the layers of wool and fur pressed around you. To move is to lose it. The stone walls surrounding you are thick, massive, ancient in some of these castles. During the day they seem solid and reassuring, but in winter they become something heavier, reservoirs of cold. All through the night they absorb the frost from outside, and by mornings they release it back into the room. If you were to press your palm flat against the wall, the stone would be colder than the morning air itself. In the damp season, moisture gathers on the surface of the rock. It appears as though the castle itself is exhaling cold, slow, steady, inexhaustible breaths from every surface at once. The servants wake before anyone else. Their footsteps move quietly through the stone corridors, soft but purposeful. They are going to kindle the fire, and there is no time to waste. But fire does not come quickly. Wood must be carried. The ashes from the night before must be raked and sorted. Some embers may still glow beneath the grey surface, and a practiced servant knows how to coax them back. The first sparks are small, almost invisible, more suggestion than flame. They appear and vanish and appear again. While the fire is only being born, the cold remains the master of the room, undisturbed and unhurried. There is no even warmth in a medieval castle, no steady surrounding heat of the kind we might take for granted, radiating from walls, rising from floors. quietly present in every corner. In a castle, warmth exists only in islands. Small, temporary, precious islands clustered around sources of fire. And so all of life in such a place bends, instinctively and constantly, toward those islands. During the day people gather in the great hall. This is where the main hearth burns, tall, wide-mouthed, its stone blackened by decades of smoke and flame. The fire crackles and settles. The wood shifts and collapses slowly into itself. The air near the fire becomes softer, more forgiving. But take 3 or 4 steps backward, and the warmth disappears almost immediately. Near the walls it is cold again. In the corners of the hall, where the shadows deepen and the stone is farthest from the flame, it is nearly as cold as the courtyard outside. Everyone understands this without being told. The closer you are to the fire, the better. People sit close together, shoulder to shoulder, knees almost touching, hands extended toward the flames. Occasionally, someone turns their back to the fire, warming the spine, the shoulders, the backs of the hands, and then turns again. This slow, unhurried rotation becomes a habit, nearly a ritual. It carries no particular significance and requires no thought. It is simply what you do when you sit near a fire in winter. The body learns it. Outside, the wind does not stop. It moves along the outer walls, searching, and sometimes it finds what it's looking for. A gap between stones, a crack beneath a door, an imperfect joint where the mortar has crumbled with age. Then a thin whistle sounds somewhere in the room. Curtains stir. The fire shivers. But no one looks up. No one reaches for anything or calls out. This too is simply how it is. The castle breathes, and the cold breathes with it. Winter in a castle is not an event. It is a condition, the way darkness is a condition, or stone, or silence. At night the cold intensifies. When the fire in the hearth dies down, either because it has not been tended, or because the wood stores must be rationed, the warmth retreats rapidly. Servants cannot always maintain a full fire through the dark house. Fuel is finite, and in lean years it is carefully preserved. By morning, the room has returned to something close to what it was before the fire was lit the evening before. Breath becomes visible. Small clouds of vapor rise from sleeping faces and dissolve into the still air. Silence deepens. Somewhere far down the corridor, a door creaks in its frame. Somewhere closer, a coal pops in the dying fire, and the sound is startlingly clear in the quiet. The castle seems almost empty in these hours. Heavy, cold, made entirely of stone, as though it is sleeping its own long, untroubled sleep. But the people inside are not troubled either. They have adjusted, not through resignation and not through indifference, but through the slow accumulation of habit and knowledge that shapes any life lived in a particular place over time. They understand something that is easy to forget in a more comfortable world, that coal is not an enemy to be defeated. It is simply a feature of winter, as reliable as the shortness of the days or the early disappearance of the light. You cannot drive it out. You can only manage your relationship to it. And so they move more slowly in the cold months. They gather in smaller rooms when the great hall is impractical to heat. They wear layers of wool against the skin and heavier layers over that, and they do not remove them unnecessarily. They cluster near sources of warmth. They find comfort in the presence of other bodies, in the shared heat of people sitting close together in a flickering room. Sometimes, seated near the fire, a person extends their hands toward the flame and holds them there. The warmth returns gradually, first to the fingers, a faint tingling, almost painful at the edges, then into the palms, then up through the wrists and forearms toward the shoulders. It is a simple thing, this slow return of warmth, but it is not a small thing. In those moments, conversation quiets. Someone tells a story. Someone else simply watches the fire without speaking. The flames move slowly, almost soothingly. Shadows sway against the stone walls, and the cold which has been present all day retreats just far enough, not gone, never entirely gone, but pushed back to the margins of the room, where it waits with its usual patience. The day ends. The pale winter light disappears early from the narrow windows. Evening comes quickly, and with it, the ritual begins again. The fire is rebuilt, the people gather. The great hall fills with the smell of burning wood and the sound of voices. And again, for a time, the castle becomes something other than cold stone. Not because of its walls, not because of its architecture or its age or its grandeur, but because of the people inside it who carry their warmth with them and share it and return each evening to the same fire, in the same room, in the same slow winter that will last, as it always has, until spring. So the days pass, slowly, quietly. The cold remains, as it always has, but beside it, always, there is fire, and light, and the sound of breathing. And if you sit with this long enough, if you let the rhythm of it settle over you, you may begin to feel it. Quiet, steady, unhurried. Like a winter night beyond thick stone walls. Like something very old and very still, and almost like rest. The old records are clear about one thing. In a castle, the walls did not keep you warm. You kept yourself warm. And the first and most important tool for doing this was not fire, not food, not shelter. It was cloth. It was wool and linen and fur and leather, layered with care, worn from the first moment of waking until the last moment before sleep, and sometimes through the night as well. In a castle in winter, dressing was not a routine, it was a discipline. The morning began not with washing. Cold water in a cold room was to be used sparingly and quickly, but with a careful, deliberate act of putting on clothes in the right order, the right combination, the right weight. There was a logic to it, understood by everyone who lived in such a place, as natural to them as the logic of building a fire or rationing wood. You learned it young, and you did not forget it. First came the linen, a long shirt, cut simply, worn directly against the skin. Linen was chosen for this innermost layer because of a quality that wool does not share. It is soft against bare skin, and it absorbs moisture. The body, even in winter, even at rest, produces warmth and perspiration. Linen draws that moisture away, keeps the skin dry, and in doing so prevents the particular misery of being cold and damp at once, which is far worse than either cold or dampness alone. The linen shirt was washed more often than any other garment, because it worked hardest and bore the most direct contact with the body. It was thin, but it was not unimportant. It was the foundation of everything that came after. Then came the wool. Wool was the great ally, the material that made winter survivable in a stone building with no central source of heat. Its properties were understood intuitively long before anyone could explain them. Wool insulates because its fibers trap air, and trapped air holds warmth. It insulates even when wet, unlike linen, unlike many other materials, which meant that a person caught in rain or damp fog did not immediately lose everything they had worked to preserve. Wool could be spun fine or left coarse, woven tightly or loosely, worn as a close-fitting tunic or a loose outer layer. It was endlessly adaptable, and in a medieval castle, it was everywhere. In the tunics worn against the linen, in the heavier garments worn over those, in the blankets and the bedding and the floor coverings where they existed. Clothing was worn in layers, one layer, then another, sometimes a third. Each additional layer of fabric held a small amount of trapped air against the body, and each layer of trapped air made the next easier to maintain. This is why multiple thin layers outperformed a single thick one. More air, more boundaries, more warmth retained. People in cold climates had understood this principle for centuries before the Middle Ages, and people in cold stone castles applied it every morning as a matter of survival. Even indoors, in the great hall or the private chambers, no one removed their outer layers unnecessarily. The castle offered no ambient warmth, no background temperature that made lightness comfortable. To sit without a cloak in a room where the fire was burning on one side and the stone wall stood cold on the other was to spend the afternoon slowly losing heat you could not easily replace. So cloaks were worn indoors as readily as outside. Heavy ones, tightly woven, sometimes lined with fur along the collar and hem. They settled over the shoulders and back like a second pair of walls. Portable, personal, always present. Among those of higher station, furs were a significant part of the winter wardrobe. Sheepskin, fox, sometimes rarer pelts for those wealthy enough to obtain them. A fur-lined cloak was not simply a luxury, though it was certainly that too. It was a genuine difference in warmth. The dense, long fibers of an animal coat trapped air in a way that woven wool could not fully replicate. And when such a cloak was drawn around the shoulders on a cold morning, the effect was immediate and tangible. The cold did not disappear, but it became manageable. It withdrew to a comfortable distance. Servants dressed more simply. The wool was coarser, the cuts less fine, the garments fewer in number and less carefully preserved. But the principle was identical. Layers, coverage, nothing left exposed that could be covered. A servant who understood cold, and all of them did, knew that a second layer of rough wool over a rough wool tunic was worth more than complaining about the temperature of the room. They wore what they had, and they wore all of it, and they wrapped their cloaks around themselves in the same way as their lords, not as ceremony, but as sense. Particular care was paid to the extremities. The feet were managed with thick wool stockings, sometimes 2 pairs, and leather shoes or boots with additional fabric stuffed inside when the cold grew serious. Feet are quick to lose warmth, quick to grow numb, and a person with cold feet cannot rest comfortably or work effectively. Keeping the feet warm was not comfort, it was function. The same logic applied to the hands. Gloves were not universally available, but people improvised. Hands tucked inside white sleeves, buried beneath a fold of cloak, pressed between the knees when sitting still. Hands near the body stayed warmer than hands in open air. This was obvious, and no one forgot it. The head was protected as well. Hoods attached to cloaks, separate wool caps, linen coifs worn beneath heavier coverings. All of these served the same purpose. A significant amount of heat escapes through the head when it is left uncovered, and in a castle where every measure of retained warmth mattered, leaving the head bare was simply wasteful. In cold seasons, something was almost always worn on the head, indoors as well as out. And at night, clothing did not disappear. Before sleep, the heavier outer garments might be set aside, the full cloak, the thickest layers, but the linen shirt remained, and often a wool layer as well. Sleeping in cold air was its own skill. A blanket alone, in a room where the fire had died down, or been deliberately reduced to save fuel, was not always enough. The combination of wool against the body and a blanket or fur above it created a layered warmth that could sustain a person through the long, cold hours before morning. Servants, accustomed to cold in a way that went beyond habit and approached something like expertise, often slept in much of what they had worn through the day. They pulled their cloaks around them, moved close to others in the same room, and let the combined warmth of bodies and fabric and proximity carry them through the night. There was a philosophy in all of this, even if no one would have named it that. Warmth in a cold stone castle that then was not given. It was produced, preserved, and carefully managed. The body generated it. Clothing held it in. Every unnecessary opening of a cloak, every moment of stillness in a cold corridor, every loosening of a layer. All of these were small losses, small leaks in the system. People moved more slowly in winter, not only because cold made movement effortful, but because unnecessary movement disrupted the warmth that had been gathered. They sat closer to the fire. They opened their cloaks less. They held still more often, conserving what they had. Life in the castle slowed with winter in this way. Footsteps became quieter. Voices carried less. There was less hurrying from room to room, less restless movement for its own sake. People settled near the fire, wrapped in their layers, and remained there. The cold taught stillness. The clothing made that stillness survivable. If you listen to the old stories long enough, you can almost feel it. The faint rustle of wool with each slow breath. The settled weight of a heavy cloak across the shoulders. The warmth building quietly beneath the layers. Not rushing anywhere. Not in any hurry to leave. Warm. Heavy. Reliable. Like a second skin worn from the first cold morning of autumn until the last. The old chronicles put it plainly. If clothing preserved the warmth of the body, then fire and food sustained life itself. They were not comforts. They were the two pillars on which every winter day in a cold stone castle rested, and without either one, the other was not enough. Fire in a medieval castle was more than flame. It was the center of everything. The day began with it and ended with it. Between those 2 points All other activities arranged themselves around it: eating, working, talking, resting, the way planets arrange themselves around a star. Drawn by gravity they do not need to think about. The fire was simply there, and everything else oriented itself accordingly. In the early morning, while it was still dark and the air in the great hall had reached its coldest point of the entire day, the servants came. They came before anyone else, before the household had stirred, because the task had to be completed before the castle woke. The main hearth in the great hall was tall, nearly the height of a person in some castles, and its stone was black with years of accumulated smoke, a darkness that spoke of countless winters already survived. But through the night the fire had quieted. What remained by morning were embers, dull, subdued, holding their heat beneath a layer of pale grey ash as though keeping a secret. The servants worked carefully. They raked the ash aside with slow, deliberate strokes, searching for the glow still living underneath. When they found it, and usually they did, a cluster of coals, still faintly orange at the center, they treated it with something that was almost gentleness. Dry kindling first. Thin slivers of wood that would catch quickly without demanding too much. Then, small branches, slightly larger, laid across the kindling at careful angles to allow air to move between them. And only after these had taken hold, only after the fire had remembered what it was doing, did the heavy logs come. The dense, slow-burning wood that would sustain the fire through the hours ahead. The flame rose gradually. It did not leap or rush. It climbed, hesitated, found its footing, and climbed again. It seemed almost to remember how to burn, as the waking from sleep required the same slow return to full presence that it required of the people nearby. And during those quiet minutes, while the fire gathered itself, the cold remained in charge of the room, unhurried, indifferent, occupying every corner and surface with the same patient authority it had held all night. Then the fire was genuinely burning. The crackle of dry wood announced it. Light began to move on the stone walls, shifting and unsteady, warmer in tone than the flat gray of the morning. The air near the hearth changed, not warm exactly, not at first, but softer, less rigid. The cold retreated a few feet reluctantly, and people began to move toward the fire. The servants first, lingering for a moment before returning to their work. Then others, as the castle gradually came to life. The household, the guards finishing a night's watch, children who had slept in rooms with no fire at all, and arrived in the great hall half frozen and seeking the nearest source of light and warmth. Everyone understood instinctively what the cold had made obvious. Warmth does not fill a room the way water fills a vessel. It does not diffuse evenly into every corner and make all places equal. Warmth stays near its source. If you want it, you must go to it. Around the fire, the day took shape. People ate there, talked there, carried out what work could be done close to the heat. A servant mended something by firelight. Two men discussed the day's tasks while standing close enough to feel the heat on their faces. A child sat on the floor near the hearth, with her knees pulled to her chest, doing nothing in particular, simply absorbing warmth through every surface of her body that she could angle toward the flame. This was not laziness. This was economy. the careful practical management of a resource that existed in only one place in the room. Food, too, was central to surviving winter in a castle, not as pleasure, though pleasure was present, but as function. A cold body burns through its reserves faster than a warm one. Eating well, eating hot, eating enough. These were not luxuries in winter. They were strategies. The cooking was slow and deliberate, in large iron pots suspended over the fire or nestled among the coals. Thick pottages simmered for hours. These were not refined preparations. They were practical ones. Whatever had been preserved from the autumn harvest, dried grains, root vegetables, legumes, onions, combined with water or weak broth and left to cook until everything softened and thickened into something dense and sustaining. Sometimes there was salted or smoked meat, cut into pieces and added to the pot. The smoke from the fire mixed faintly with the steam from the cooking, and the smell of both filled the hall together, indistinguishable from each other, both signaling the same thing, that the fire was burning, and something warm was being made. Bread was heavy and dark, made from coarser grains that kept longer than finer ones. It was broken rather than cut, and sometimes held near the fire for a few minutes to warm it before eating. A small refinement that cost nothing and improved everything. Salt meat and smoked provisions appeared at winter tables, not because anyone particularly preferred them to fresh food, but because they kept. A carcass salted in November could still feed people in February. The preservation of food in autumn was an act of foresight, whose rewards arrived precisely in the coldest months, when there was nothing growing and nothing fresh to be had. Meals were eaten slowly. There was no particular reason to rush, and the cold argued against it. A hot bowl of pottage held between cold hands was worth savoring. The warmth of the food moved through the body differently than the warmth of the fire. The fire warmed from outside. The face, the hands, the front of the body turned toward the flames. Food warmed from inside, spreading through the chest and stomach and outward toward the limbs in a way that was slower but more total. Both were necessary. They worked together. A person who had eaten a hot meal beside a good fire was, for a while at least, genuinely warm. Not merely less cold, but warm in a way that made the rest of the winter day manageable. Warm drinks played their part as well. Weak ale, slightly warmed, or wine heated with dried herbs and spices, when such things were available. The drinks were not strong. That was not the purpose. The purpose was the warmth of the cup against the palms, the heat of the liquid moving down the throat, the soft and spreading comfort that followed. People held their cups in both hands without thinking about it, the way you lean toward a source of light without deciding to. The body knew what it needed. In the smaller rooms of the castle, where no large hearth had been built, braziers served in the fire's place. These were metal vessels, sometimes elegantly made and sometimes entirely plain, filled with glowing coals and set on the floor or on low stands. They did not produce the warmth of a full hearth. They were modest, careful sources of heat, enough to take the worst edge off a small room, enough to warm the hands held above them, enough to make the immediate vicinity of a bed slightly less brutal on a cold night. They required attention and caution. A brazier tipped or left unattended in a closed room was a genuine danger. but used carefully they extended the reach of warmth into the parts of the castle the great hearth could not touch. Night changed the balance again. As the fire in the great hall was allowed to diminish, wood was finite, and no household could afford to burn through its stores recklessly. The warmth it had lent to the day retreated with it. The servants did what they could, but there were limits. By the deep hours of the night, only the embers remained, faintly glowing, barely visible. A quiet, diminished light in a cold and silent room. But even that small light carried meaning. It was a reminder. It said, the warmth is still here. It has not gone entirely. It is resting, and in the morning it will return. And the people sleeping nearby, wrapped in wool and fur, curled toward one another for shared heat, fell asleep knowing this. The fire would be rebuilt in the morning. The pot would go back on. The bread would be broken, and the ale warmed, and the day would begin again in the same way it always did, with the patient, practiced tending of a small flame, and the careful accumulation of everything that warmth required. Winter could be long, the cold could be constant, but as long as the fire burned and the pot was full and the bread was there to be broken, life continued. Slowly, quietly, without hurry. And if you listen carefully enough, even now, you can almost hear it. The crackle of wood catching, the low bubble of something cooking, the soft sound of a cup set down on stone, and the warmth, modest, patient, entirely sufficient, staying close. The chronicles are particular about the night. They describe it as a different kind of time, not simply the absence of day, but a distinct condition with its own roles, its own demands, its own relationship to cold. During the day, cold could be managed. There was fire, movement, the warmth of other people nearby, the activity of the body doing its work. There were voices and footsteps, and the crackle of the hearth. All of these pushed back against the cold, held it at a manageable distance, made the waking hours survivable, and sometimes even comfortable. At night, all of that ceased, and the cold grew deeper. When the torches in the corridors were extinguished one by one, and the great hall began to empty as people drifted toward their sleeping places, a particular quiet settled over the castle. It was not an uncomfortable quiet exactly. People who had lived in such places all their lives knew it well and did not fear it. But it was a quiet with weight to it, a stillness in which the cold became more present, more noticeable, more patient than it had seemed all day. The stone walls, which had absorbed cold all through the long winter night before, gave it back steadily and without hurry. The fire in the hearth diminished, the shadows deepened, and those who were preparing for sleep knew, as they had always known, that the night ahead would be cold, and that sleeping through it required preparation. This preparation was not casual. It was careful, practiced, and understood by everyone in the castle as a necessary part of the day's end, as important as banking the fire or securing the doors. Sleep in a cold castle was not simply rest. It was the preservation of warmth across the hours of darkness until morning, when the fire could be rebuilt and the work of warming the day could begin again. To sleep carelessly was to wake cold and depleted. To sleep well, to manage the night successfully, was its own form of skill. The beds of those with means were engineered for exactly this purpose. They were tall and heavy, built on wooden frames that raised the sleeper off the cold stone floor, where the air was coldest and the drafts moved most freely. The mattresses were stuffed with straw or, for those of higher station, with down or feathers, materials that compressed gently under the weight of a body and held a pocket of warmth against it. Over the mattress went layers of coverings, wool blankets, heavy and dense, sometimes with fur laid over them for the coldest nights. These were not light coverings. They were substantial, almost burdensome, and that weight was precisely the point. Heavy blankets do not merely cover, they press close, seal gaps, trap the air warmed by the body and hold it still. A light blanket lets warmth drift away. A heavy one keeps it in. But the most distinctive feature of a castle bed was not its mattress or its blankets. It was the curtains. Around the frame of the bed hung heavy fabric panels, drawn closed at night on all sides. Above, a canopy, the baldachin, stretched across the top, completing the enclosure. This arrangement is often described as decorative, a mark of status and refinement, and it was certainly that. But its primary purpose was entirely practical. Closed bed curtains created a small, separate room within the room, a private chamber within the larger cold chamber, where the warmth of the sleeping body could accumulate rather than dispersing into the open air. Inside the drawn curtains, the air was still. It could not circulate and carry warmth away. It simply sat, held in place by the fabric on all sides, growing slowly warmer as the night progressed and the body continued to generate heat. Inside, behind the curtains, everything changed. The sounds of the castle muffled. The faint movements of other people in distant rooms became softer, more remote. The air was close and quiet. The cold, which had been so present everywhere else, receded to the edges. Still there, just outside the curtains. But no longer the immediate, pressing reality it had been moments before. The body, already warm from its layers of linen and wool, because people did not undress fully before sleeping, the linen shirt always remaining, often a wool layer as well, began to warm the small enclosed space around it. The process was slow, but it was reliable. Given enough time and enough layers, a person could be genuinely warm inside a curtained bed in a room where their own breath would have been visible as vapor in the open air. Before lying down, certain preparations helped accelerate this process. Stones were heated at the hearth during the evening, left among the coals until they had absorbed as much warmth as they could hold, then wrapped carefully in cloth and carried to the bed. Placed beneath the covers at the foot, they provided immediate warmth to the coldest part of the bed, the area farthest from the body and therefore slowest to warm in naturally. The heat from a fire-warmed stone does not last the entire night, but it does not need to. It lasts long enough for the body to take over, long enough for the initial shock of cold linen against warm skin to pass and become instead the gathering of something more sustained. Small braziers with coals were sometimes placed beside the bed as well, the faint glow visible through the fabric of the curtains, the modest warmth adding to the enclosed atmosphere. They required careful placement and a measure of caution, but used sensibly. They extended the evening's warmth into the early hours of the night. The servants slept differently and without most of these provisions. Many had no private beds at all. They arranged themselves in the grey hall or in the rooms where they worked, on wooden benches or simple pallets laid on the floor. What they had was their clothing, worn through the day, kept on through the night, and their cloaks, drawn around them as they settled down. What they also had, and used without ceremony or self-consciousness, was one another. Sleeping close together was not born of affection or choice, but of cold pragmatism. Two bodies in proximity lose less heat than one body alone. Three bodies lose less still. Against the wall near the hearth, where even a dying fire left the surrounding stone faintly warmer than the rest of the room, a group of servants, wrapped in their cloaks and pressed together, could sustain a tolerable warmth through a winter night. They knew this the way they knew everything about managing cold, not from instruction, but from long experience of what worked and what did not. The most fortunate sleeping spots were nearest the hearth, even when the fire had been reduced to its overnight minimum. A bed of coals rather than active flame, carefully managed to last until morning without consuming more wood than necessary. The stone surrounding the fireplace retained heat for hours after the flames had quieted. A person sleeping within range of that radiated warmth occupied a meaningfully different night from someone sleeping across the hall. These places were understood to be valuable, and those who had the right to claim them did so without hesitation. The night passed slowly, as cold nights do. Sometimes the wind could be heard outside the walls, not dramatically, not in gusts that shook the castle, but as a steady, low sound moving along the stone, searching the outer surfaces for weaknesses. Sometimes the door somewhere in the castle shifted in its frame with a muffled creak. Sometimes nothing at all was audible, only the deep, encompassing silence of a winter night in a building made of stone and wood and old timber, where everything had been still for hours. Inside the curtained bed, breathing slowed. The body, no longer working against the cold, settled into the particular ease of being genuinely warm in a cold place. Sleep came gradually, without hurry. Not the sudden dropping into unconsciousness of exhaustion, but the slow, gentle descent of a body that has everything it needs. Sometimes a person woke in the night. The air had shifted. The warmth had thinned slightly as the hours passed, and the stones cooled and the coals faded further. They pulled the blankets tighter without fully waking, drew their knees towards their chest, tucked their chin lower. The body made these adjustments almost on its own, and then sleep returned. There was no fear in it, only habit and the quiet confidence of people who had learned exactly how much warmth they needed and exactly how to keep it. Morning would come. The fire would be rebuilt. The day would begin. But for now, heavy blankets, still air, deep silence, and the slow, unhurried arrival of sleep. Warm enough, safe enough, sufficient, exactly as it always had been, in those old stone rooms, on those long winter nights, in the dark behind the curtains, where the cold could not quite reach. The old records describe winter life in a castle as something that moves slowly, not because the people inside it were idle or without purpose, but because slowness was the correct response to cold. Everything that winter demanded of a person required patience. The fire that could not be rushed, the food that needed hours to cook, the warmth that accumulated gradually under layers of wool and fur and could be lost in a moment of carelessness. Haste, in such a place, was not a virtue. It was a waste of energy, a disruption of the careful rhythms that made survival not just possible, but livable. And so the castle in winter moved at winter's pace, measured, deliberate, unhurried. And in this there was a kind of wisdom. Even the simplest matters of cleanliness and daily care took on a different character in the cold months. Water in winter was cold, not merely cool, but genuinely, sharply cold, drawn from wells or cisterns where it had been sitting in near freezing air. To make it warm required fire, and fire required wood, and wood was among the most carefully managed resources in the castle. Heating enough water for a full bath was not a casual undertaking. It meant a substantial fire maintained for a sustained period, large iron pots filled and refilled, servants carrying water and tending the heat, all for something that would be over in an hour and would need to be done again in a few days. It was done, but not frequently. A full bath in the depths of winter was an occasion, not a routine, something that happened when circumstances allowed, and the cold was not so severe as to make the whole enterprise miserable from start to finish. On ordinary days, people managed differently. A cloth warmed near the fire, damp but not dripping, drawn across the face and hands and neck. This was the daily practice of cleanliness for most people in most seasons, and in winter it was a practice for nearly everyone. It was quick, it was sufficient, and it preserved both warmth and the fuel needed to sustain it. The cloth was rinsed, warmed again, folded away. The whole process took only minutes, done near the fire, in the small radius of warmth that the morning flame had established. It was not unpleasant. It was simply what cleanliness looked like when the alternative required more heat than could reasonably be spared. Clothing was approached with the same economy. Washing garments meant heating water in quantity, working with wet fabric in cold air, and then waiting for things to dry. A slow and uncertain process in winter, when even items hung near the fire could take a long time to dry fully through their thickness. Clothes were not washed frequently. They were aired instead, taken outside on days when the air was dry, even if it was cold, and hung where the wind could move through the fibers. They were shaken out and inspected for wear, repaired where needed, brushed clean of visible soil. They were managed carefully just because they had to be, because replacing them was difficult and expensive, because the warmth they provided was worth far more than the inconvenience of wearing them unwashed. Cleanliness in a medieval castle in winter was not measured by the same standards we might apply today. It was measured by function. Did the clothing still provide warmth and protection? Then it was sufficient. The days themselves followed a pattern that changed little from one to the next. Morning began with the fire, as it always did. The embers coaxed back to life, the kindling laid, the larger wood added once the smaller had taken. Then the work of the day began, distributed according to station and responsibility, but unified by the cold that shaped all of it. The servants moved through their tasks with the efficiency of long practice. Wood carried, water heated, food prepared, rooms attended to, animals cared for in the outbuildings beyond the castle's main walls. Their movements were economical, not because they had been instructed to conserve energy, but because experience had taught them the same lesson that the cold teaches everyone eventually, that unnecessary effort is a debt paid in warmth, and warmth was not something to spend carelessly. Those of higher station spent their days closer to the fire, but not idle. There were decisions to be made, accounts to review, correspondence to consider. Visitors came occasionally, even in winter, and had to be received. Problems arose, with supplies, with the condition of the building, with the people who depended on the household, and had to be addressed. But much of this took place at the fireside, seated rather than moving, conducted in a pace that matched the season. Conversations were longer and less urgent in winter. Stories were told with more detail. A question that might have been answered quickly in summer was discussed more fully when there was no particular reason to be elsewhere. Sometimes someone read aloud. This was a particular pleasure of winter evenings. A voice speaking steadily in a firelit room, carrying a story or a passage of scripture or a description of distant places, while the listeners sat wrapped in their cloaks and the fire shifted and settled. Reading aloud was not primarily a performance. It was a way of filling shared time with something that required no movement, no cold, no expenditure of the things that winter made precious. The voice itself was a kind of warmth, present, human, pushing gently against the silence that would otherwise have been the only thing to listen to. And silence, too, had its place. The silence of a winter evening in a castle was not an uncomfortable thing. It was full rather than empty, full of the sound of the fire, of wind moving along the outer walls, of breathing and small movements and the distant creak of old timber settling. People sat in this silence without feeling it unnecessarily. There was an ease to being together in a warm place without speaking, a companionship that required no particular content to sustain it. The fire was there. The warmth was there. That was enough. The light failed early. By mid-afternoon in the depths of winter, the pale light that came through the narrow windows had already begun to fade. Candles were lit, tallow mostly, with the finer wax candles reserved for particular occasions or particular rooms. The light was soft and unsteady, not bright enough to illuminate a large space fully but sufficient to create a circle of visibility around each flame, a small warm pool of light in which things could be done and people could sit together. The candles could not warm the room, but they changed its character. Darkness with a candle in it is different from darkness without one. The shadows were still present, still deep in the corners and along the ceilings, but the light gave the room a center, a point around which the evening could organize itself. Evening brought people together again, in the way that each part of the day in a cold castle brought people together, not always by preference, but by the simple gravitational pull of warmth and light. Someone mended clothing near the fire. Someone else prepared what could be prepared for the following day's meals. Children, who had been underfoot since morning, finally grew quiet. The servants, whose day had been longest and whose work had been heaviest, found a moment of stillness, a few minutes seated near the fire with their hands extended toward the heat, eyes half closed, bodies releasing the effort of the day. That moment of stillness, small as it was, mattered. Not because it solved anything or changed the cold or made the morning's work any lighter, but because it was there, reliable, recurring, earned at the end of each day's labor. The fire, the warmth, the quiet, the sense that the castle was intact around them, the walls holding, the night outside doing what the night did, and everything inside continuing as it had continued through all the winters before this one. The days were similar to one another, as winter days in a confined place tend to be. The same tasks, the same rhythms, the same fire rebuilt each morning from the same dying coals. But in that repetition was something steady and sustaining, a structure that held when everything outside was cold and uncertain. The castle stood, the fire burned. The people lived neither fighting the winter nor pretending it was not there, but simply receiving it, day after day, with a patience that was itself a kind of warmth. And now, at the end of this long story, if you have been listening all the way through, perhaps everything around you has grown a little quieter, a little stiller, a little warmer, as though you too are somewhere inside those thick stone walls, where the winter moves slowly past outside, and the fire holds its small, steady ground, and the night comes gently, without hurry, and the breath grows even, and the eyes grow heavy, and sleep arrives at last, like something long expected, quiet, warm, unhurried, just like that.